When Leo III died in 741, he left three immediate legacies which would have an impact on the Byzantine world. One is that he had founded the legitimacy of the Isaurian dynasty, and the people accepted that members of this house should rule the empire. The second thing is that he had left the empire in the hands of his young son, Constantine V, who was around 21 or so at the time. And the third fact is that he had inaugurated an era of iconoclastic policies whereby the Byzantine state was engaged in destroying and confiscating icons and preventing their use and worship. Now, this last fact, the institution of iconoclasm, was something that was not universally popular, and in fact, there was a pretty strong resistance to it in the capital itself, and possibly also in the Balkans and definitely in Italy. Well, another factor is that because Constantine was still getting his feet under him, and he had this unpopular policy to perpetuate, there was a bit of a vulnerability. Not from an outsider, as I said, the Isaurian dynasty was fairly well entrenched by this point due to Leo III's successes. However, if someone, say, had family ties and a power base, they could still exploit anti-iconoclastic sentiment and make a run at the throne. And it turns out there was such a person, and his name was Artabazdas. His attempt at usurpation from 742 to 743 dominates the early years of Constantine V's reign, and I think that it's only fitting that we talk about Artabazdas before we move on and talk about Constantine V, since basically if we were to talk about Constantine V, his first actions deal with this very crisis caused by Artabazdas. So without any further ado, let's just talk about Artabazdas, and that will provide the perfect segue into Constantine V, which, yes, will be coming up soon. So who was Artabazdas and where did he come from? Well, it's pretty clear from his name that he was of Armenian descent. Most likely his ancestors had been refugees from Armenia who had then settled in Roman territory, and his family was probably relatively well off just based on the fact that Artabazdas was able to gain a governorship. So they might have been a noble family in Armenia, which then fled and was able to retain its rank and wealth in Byzantine lands. We don't actually know how old Artabazdas was, so for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that he was a near contemporary of Leo III, since they were both governors and Artabazdas was still alive and kicking and also active when Leo III died. So I'm going to guess that he was around 55 to 60 years old when Leo kicked the bucket in 741, but again, that is just a guess. I don't actually know. In 713, Anastasius II appointed Artabazdas to be the new strategos of the Armeniacan theme, and this is actually the first known fact about Artabazdas' life. His thematic capital was at the city of Amasya. At some point during his 4-year tenure as strategos, he made an agreement with the future Emperor Leo III to overthrow Theodosius III, and that is really his main claim to fame, is, combining the forces of the two most powerful themes to overthrow the sitting emperor. Part of the agreement between Leo and Artabazdas is that Artabazdas was to become Leo's son-in-law and serve as a senior official in his government. So Artabazdas married Leo's daughter Anna, and he took up the position of Curopalates, which means the master of the palace. This is a very high-ranking position within the Byzantine administration. And in addition to that office, he retained control of the Armeniacan theme by having his son Nikitas as strategos there. So it was retained by his portion of the family, effectively. And he also controlled the Opsikion theme, which was just on the other side of the straits from Constantinople. And in terms of supporting coups and all that kind of stuff, Opsikiacan theme was actually the most well-positioned of all of the themes, pretty much. It looks like his eldest son, Nikitas, was by a previous wife, but he has a son named Nikiphorus, who was younger and seems to have been Anna's son. So by the time that Leo died, Artabazdas has put himself in a very strong position. He has support within the capital, and he has one of his sons in control of one of the two strongest themes in the empire. So it should come as no surprise that Artabasdos was able to mount this attempt at seizing the throne. In June of 741, Leo III died, and he was succeeded by his son Constantine V, who was 21 or 22 years old. This means that Constantine V was not particularly vulnerable, and he had also been associated on the throne with his father for some years, and presumably had a pretty decent amount of experience when compared with a whole lot of new emperors. In summer of 742, Constantine V apparently thought that his position at home was secure, and he saw a crisis in the east, so he decided to lead an army there to fight the Arabs. So it looks like Constantine was completely unaware of Artabasdos' intentions, and that Artabasdos had managed to plan in secret without the emperor hearing about it. The problem that Constantine inherited is that Leo had really left the empire divided over the issue of icons. And there were people willing to back a candidate who would support the restoration of these icons. So Artabasdos understood that, and he decided to use his family ties, position of power, and the support of the Iconodules in the capital to seize the moment and make himself emperor and then pass the throne along in his new branch of the Isaurian dynasty. So let's look at how this coup goes. Most coups are relatively private affairs, or they capitalize on unpopularity and gain overwhelming support before moving forward. But Artabasdos seems to have triggered his coup a little bit early, possibly prematurely. So Artabasdos revolted while Constantine V was in the field and marching towards the frontier in June of 742. It looks like Artabasdos raised a force and went out to meet the emperor in open battle. It's possible that Artabasdos had been plotting and then he got discovered, so then he decided to just risk it all in a battle. It's also possible that Constantine had ordered him to raise a force and join his army for the Eastern Campaign, and then Artabasdos had revealed his intentions by attacking. It's not really clear exactly what the circumstances were, but this is a fairly unusual way to begin a coup. At any rate, the two forces met, and Artabasdos was able to hand the young emperor a defeat. And then, rather than following up and defeating Constantine once and for all, Artabasdos instead opted to march on to Constantinople, where he crowned himself emperor and also gave the same honor to his second son, Nicephorus. For Constantine V, he didn't have the manpower to retake the capital, so he decided to build up his strength. So he retreated to Amorium, which was the old thematic capital of Anatolikon, a place where his father had built up his strength before taking the throne. And here he presumably had a friendly reception. It looks like most of the people in this area were iconoclast, and most of the soldiers here still had some, at least institutional memory of Leo III, so they were happy to take up the cause of his son. This is an artist rendition of what Amorium would have looked like a little after this period, around the year 800 or so. It would have been a fairly typical Byzantine provincial city. Following their battle in the summer of 742, both imperial contenders decided to spend the fall and winter preparing their forces for a decisive battle. So Artabasdos in Constantinople was raising troops, while Constantine V was doing the same thing in Amorium. At the same time, Artabasdos also restored the icons in Constantinople, and this really seems to have rallied the support of the Iconodule majority behind him in the capital. It also earned him the support of Pope Zacharias in Rome. It looks like a lot of icons had not been destroyed, and that Leo III's ban on icons had not been very effective. So a lot of things had been reported destroyed, ended up being pulled out of storage and displayed. And later on, when Constantine V really intensifies the anti-icon persecution, it's probably because he knew that without harsh measures, there would be no real or lasting results. So, in some ways, you could make the case that Artabasdos' usurpation is probably what really made iconoclasm take a hard turn and become more about persecuting people than about destroying images. In the spring of 743, having arranged things at home, Artabasdos led his army out of Constantinople in person and he entered into Asia Minor seeking a decisive battle with Constantine. It's pretty clear from the context that Artabazes' hope was that he would hunt down Constantine and eliminate his only real rival to power. With Constantine gone, he was the next best representative of the Isaurian dynasty, or at least his son Nicephorus was, and there wouldn't really be another strong contender to his power. So, Artabazes was hoping for a decisive battle, and eventually Constantine offered him battle near the ruins of Sardis in Asia Minor in May of 743. This battle was a clear victory for Constantine, but it was not a decisive victory. Artabazes seems to have been discouraged, however, and he withdrew to the capital and left the war in the hands of his eldest son Nicetas, who had to spend a reasonable amount of time reorganizing before he was able to challenge Constantine once again. So Artabazes had lost the battle, but the war was still far from over. So let's look at the remainder of the war. Later on in the summer, Constantine and Nicetas fought a battle at Modrine, and this was another victory for Constantine. However, despite the fact that he had carried the field, he still left Nicetas' army intact once again, and Nicetas was ultimately able to rally his men and threaten Constantine's line of march and prevent his easy passage into Europe. So this would necessitate yet another battle between the two forces. So at Nicomedia, the two commanders met in battle once again, but this time Nicetas was captured, and this put an end to his army. And after this victory, Constantine V was able to cross over into Europe and initiate a siege of Constantinople. So the end was nigh for Artabazes and his brief reign. The siege of Constantinople didn't last for long. On November 2nd, 743, the Byzantine capital fell, and Constantine V re-entered the city victorious. Artabazes and his sons Nicetas and Nicephorus were all blinded and forced to enter a monastery. We don't know exactly when they died, but we do know that based on the way that blinding was practiced, if the blinding procedure was brutal, then people often would die of infection soon after. And it's not really clear how rough the procedure was. So it's possible that these guys lived for several more years. It's also possible that they all died within weeks of the procedure due to infection or other complications. When we speak of failed usurpers, there usually isn't all that much to say when it comes to talking about their long-term legacy and impact. However, in the case of Artabazes, there's a fair amount that we can say. He's an indispensable figure in the establishment of the Isaurian dynasty. After all, without his aid, it's unlikely that Leo III would have been able to overthrow Theodosius III, and it's even more unlikely that he would have been able to maintain a stable dynasty and reestablish order after 20 or so years of almost nonstop chaos. It also, with Artabazes, we can see in the events of his life and his attempted usurpation that religious positions could be and were exploited for political gain by imperial contenders. So it's not just a matter of someone could do something. We have an example of this happening in action thanks to Artabazes. And we could also go a step further and say that possibly the reason why something like iconoclasm was implemented and later ended is simply due to the balance of military force on one side as opposed to the other. The fact that the population seems to have been very receptive to his usurpation hints that iconoclast may have either been a minority in the empire or else a regional phenomenon, as many old school scholars like to talk about when they said that icons were a part of worship in the West, but people in the East who were influenced by Jewish and Muslim traditions tended to not favor icons. So it's actually sort of probably one of the cornerstones of the older generation of scholars' interpretation of iconoclasm. Artabazes' betrayal may also have really played a role in making Constantine V who he was later. So we see his generalship first blossoming during this time. He loses his initial battle, but then he wins 3 in a row to reclaim power. And he also has a speedy siege of Constantinople. And also it's possible that due to the fervor with which the restoration of the icons was greeted, that Constantine V was convinced that he needed to take a firmer stance on icons than his father had, and that firmer stance needed to involve the persecution of people and not just the destruction of images. So it's possible that indirectly Artabasdos more or less made Constantine V a man, if you will. Like he was his impetus to become the Constantine V that we know of in history, rather than just another ruler named Constantine. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Artabasdos. I'll be coming back soon with another video about Constantine V, so stay tuned. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. When I initially began making my series on the Byzantine emperors, I figured that a lot of people would want to hear about Basil the Bulgar Slayer or Alexius Comnenus. However, the most requested emperor, and by a long shot, is Constantine V Copronymus. And in this video, I really hope that I live up to the expectations of the people who have been anticipating this video for a few months at this point. I would like to look at Constantine and what makes him so fascinating to both modern audiences and to the Byzantines themselves. He was a figure of some controversy in the sources. Two things stand out before we go into his life in detail. One is that of all of the iconoclast emperors, Constantine V is the most staunch in his belief and in his practice of avoiding the use of icons. He was semi-fanatical about it. And the other noteworthy thing about Constantine, if you're doing the Cliff's Note version, is that he is the emperor who really got Byzantium back on the offensive for the first time really since Heraclius. Now, other emperors had mounted some attacks here or there, but Constantine throughout his reign will be on the offensive in both the east and the west, and it looks like he wins the majority of the battles that he fights. So let's go into detail and look at what makes Constantine V Copronymus. Constantine was born in 718, and he was then crowned as co-emperor in 720. For context, Leo III, his father, had only seized power in 717, so Constantine was born very early in Leo's reign. His nickname, Copronymus, shit-named, comes from a time when the infant Constantine was baptized and given his name. Well, something went wrong when he was being baptized. He happened to defecate in the baptismal water, at least according to hostile iconodule sources. So, therefore, he earned the nickname Copronymus, or shit-named. Now, the meaning of this is twofold. One, it is supposed to be a bit of a joke, and it's clearly trying to sully Constantine in a direct way by comparing him with shit. But the other thing is a little more subtle, and the idea is that since baptism is a sacrament, then the fact that Constantine's was a bit botched means that there's something wrong with him, that he's not straight in the eyes of God. So this is a way for hostile iconophile sources to smear him and make him look religiously illegitimate. So it's actually a fairly clever ploy, and it's not as immature as it seems at first glance. It's a fairly sophisticated smear if you accept the premises of people at the time. His first wife was the daughter of a Khazar Khan. Her name was Tizitzak. Later, when she moved to Constantinople, she changed her name to Irene, which is a Greek name. And the couple was married in 732 when young Constantine was 14 years old. Later on, he'll have two other wives. In 741, when Leo III died, it appeared that Constantine V was in store for a smooth succession. The only major problem in the empire at this time was that iconoclasm was still divisive. However, the empire had officially had iconoclasm now for about 11 years, and despite some resentment, it hadn't really sparked, say, a major revolt or something of that nature, so Constantine V had no real worries on that front, most likely. When he came to power, he was 22 to 23 years old, and he had been associated with the throne for about 20 years, so people were accustomed to seeing him on coins, and he was well established and presumably relatively experienced in government. So it seems like, from what we can tell, he spent his first year or so in the capital consolidating his power and doing other things. And then, after about a year, he decided that it was time to go out and go on campaign. And that's when he faced his first crisis. Let's now take a look at the first major challenge that was presented to Constantine V, the revolt of Artabazdas. If you want to hear a full version of this revolt, then I recommend that you check out my video on Artabazdas. But for now, we'll just keep it rather brief. In the summer of 742, Constantine V was marching through Asia Minor on his way to the eastern frontier, where he was going to launch an attack on the Umayyad Caliphate. But as he was on the march, one of his most important retainers, Artabazdas, revolted. The two of them fought an open battle. Artabazdas was victorious. Now, rather than following up Constantine and trying to finish him off once and for all, Artabazdas decided to make straight for Constantinople, where he was able to claim the crown, and he was able to restore the icons, which then made him popular with a certain group in the empire. Constantine, for his part, retreated to the city of Amorium in Asia Minor, which had been his father's thematic capital before he had revolted in 717. The two forces spent the winter of 742-743 gathering men and gearing up for a final confrontation, and in the spring of 743, both claimants were ready to battle it out to be the true heir of Leo III. And the reason why this is a real struggle is because Artabazdas had some degree of legitimacy, since he was the son-in-law of Leo and had helped him come to the throne all the way back in 717. Not to mention that he had grandchildren who, he had children who were the grandchildren of Leo, so he also could claim to be every bit as, or at least pretty close to as legitimate as Constantine V himself. So this was a severe challenge, and it also showed that if Constantine V had thought that the icon issue maybe wasn't all that dangerous, that he had miscalculated. During the campaign of 743, Constantine first demonstrates his military talent. He faced Artabazdas or his sons 3 different times in Asia Minor and was victorious on all 3 occasions. After thoroughly defeating the armies of Artabazdas, Constantine crossed into Europe and laid siege to Constantinople. In November of 743, the city surrendered to Constantine, and then he entered the city, had Artabazdas and his sons deposed and blinded, and resumed his rule. And by the way, this image apparently comes from a manuscript and might be the most accurate physical depiction of Constantine V. So, if YouTube doesn't give me the option of using the title slide as a thumbnail, then you're looking at the image which will become the thumbnail. And I guess if you clicked on the video and this already was the thumbnail, then that would be odd, but obviously I'm recording all this before I get to see what images YouTube will offer me as defaults. Yeah, this is sort of some inside the studio stuff. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But at any rate, let's move on. The thing that Constantine V is best known for is his iconoclasm, and in particular, his intense iconoclasm. Now, Leo III had also been an iconoclast, and he had banned the use of icons in 730. However, Leo had never persecuted anyone or tried to remove them from power because they believed that icons were acceptable. However, Constantine V was far more interested in theology than his father had ever been, and his belief in banning icons was absolute. So, oftentimes scholars assume that because Artabazdas was able to embrace the iconodule position and gain a lot of public support, that this really incensed Constantine, and also the fact that so many icons popped up after Artabazdas restored them, that Constantine realized that his father's policies hadn't gone far enough or been effective. So he decided that he needed to go further, since he did regard icons as being impious and an insult to the empire and imperial authority. There's also another possibility that no one has brought up to the best of my knowledge. Perhaps because Constantine was so theologically motivated, it's possible that when he first came to power, he was talking loosely about intensifying iconoclastic policies, and that this is why so many people were willing to embrace Artabazus. Maybe Constantine created some of the backlash that Artabazus was able to take advantage of by talking about, moving towards something like a persecution. And we'll notice that there's a fairly considerable gap between Constantine retaking the throne in 743 and then actually implementing a full-scale persecution in 754. And this may be because he was biding his time and waiting to do something that he had intended to do even before Artabazus had revolted. But this is just speculation on my part. I don't really know for sure, but neither do the people who say that Artabazus' revolt is what sparked Constantine to go a step further. Source limitations really prevent us from being able to fully trace the evolution of Constantine V's thoughts on whether or not he should persecute people who believe in icons and go a step further than his father had gone by just simply banning the use of icons. However, we do know that by 754, Constantine V had made up his mind and he had decided that it was necessary to persecute people who worshipped using icons. So, he convened a council at Hira in that year, 754, and this council was packed full of iconoclasts, and their purpose was not to debate this issue, but rather to simply pass measures that were discriminatory against iconophiles. We do know from later sources which quoted some of what Constantine said that his argument seems to have been that the very existence of icons and their depiction of Christ in human form had a lot of unorthodox implications about the nature of Christ. So he was bringing Christology into this, and of course that's a big can of worms that has come up over and over and over already in the series, and many emperors had fallen afoul of issues regarding the nature of Christ. Anyway, the persecution itself, the purpose of it seems to have been to root out iconodules from the army and the bureaucracy. Maybe that's why so many scholars think that this was inspired by the support that Artabazus got. Constantine V thought that the only people who could be truly loyal were the people who shared his religious beliefs. It's also possible, though, that if Leo III had banned icons in the first place because he thought that this was the source of God's displeasure against the Byzantines, then maybe Constantine V thought that the best way to promote the welfare of the state was to ban people who were impure in their religious thought, and that this would be pleasing to God and good for the empire. At any rate, it's kind of hard to say with any degree of full certainty. Constantine V also heavily targeted monasteries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the reason why he hated monasteries so much is because monks tended to be the biggest supporters of icons and also the people most likely to hide them places and prevent imperial authorities from finding and destroying them. And although the council had some limits as to what they were willing to do, these were all priests and, not an emperor who was bent on really reforming by force and state power. But Constantine actually ended up going beyond what the council decided, and he actually condemned all saint cults and relics as being in the family of icons. The only one that he didn't condemn was the cult of the Virgin Mary. He clearly had a lot of theological beliefs, and he was a very fervent believer. And as emperor, he thought that it was both his right and his duty to enforce his beliefs on others. And he spent a considerable amount of his time doing this. Although, as we'll see, he did plenty of other things as well, and he presumably was not a full-blown obsessive. Constantine V's persecution of iconodules hit two groups of people in particular. One group are officials, people who are either in the civil service or in the army, and the other group are monks and nuns. For monks and nuns, the thinking is that they can potentially be socially disruptive, and also that they are often the people who are hiding a lot of these icons and perpetuating what Constantine V saw as an impious act. However, he also had a desire to better utilize the empire's manpower and resources. The more people who go into monasteries, the fewer soldiers Constantine has, and also the fewer people who will be having children who will then grow up to be future soldiers. So, in Constantine's mind, he wanted to keep the number of people who were celibate to somewhat of a minimum. So, his idea was to use this opportunity presented by um, iconoclasm to do just that. So once he had an assembly of monks and nuns in the hippodrome, paired them off, and then forced them to marry or otherwise face blinding and exile. So he essentially got rid of two groups of people he saw as unproductive and potentially um, disruptive in his society. And his thought was that they would then go on to be productive citizens and produce future soldiers for his armies. Um, in addition to going after individual monks and nuns, Constantine also went after monastic property, and he used the money from that for the benefit of the state and his army. As we'll see, he fought plenty of wars, and I imagine that the expenses for those had to run quite high. Based on Constantine's persecution of iconophiles and the fact that it was those very iconophiles who ended up writing the history, it should now not be much of a mystery as to why he was called Copernicus the shit-named. So, you might think, well, he must have been a deeply unpopular emperor if he got saddled with that name. Well, the thing is, actually, there's pretty good evidence that he was actually pretty popular overall, and that he was a well-loved emperor by most of the population. And that begs the question, well, how was he popular if you have a large chunk of the empire, a group that's highly influential with the population as a whole, namely the monks? How did he overcome the hostility of such an influential group in society and maintain his popularity? Well, it appears that his popularity came from two sources. One is that he was popular because he won the vast majority of his battles. And two, and probably more importantly, he was able to provide inexpensive and abundant food to the population of the capital. So what it appears is that he was able to find a grain source and then subsidize it in order to keep people in the city fed. Something that hadn't been the case since the time of Heraclius, after the Byzantines lost control of Egypt, which had been their breadbasket for the city of Constantinople. So this was a major thing that would make someone popular, and it also will enable the city of Constantinople to begin to grow once again, since cities of that size can't really provide for themselves and they rely heavily on imports that are subsidized. In 717, Leo and Artabazdas had been Strategoi who revolted and seized the throne. So, as the son of Leo and the former opponent of Artabazdas, Constantine V was well aware of the danger of the Strategoi governing themes. And his thematic reform, which resulted in the creation of the Tagmata, was probably informed heavily by his knowledge of recent history. So, Constantine redrew the boundaries of the themes just a bit. This was designed to weaken the Stratogoys a little so they would be less menacing to the emperor. And while doing that, he also formed new units in the capital. Now, older units in the capital had been designed to guard the palace and to keep public order, and these troops could still do that. But now they are given additional tasks. And this new design for these units, the Tagmata, is that something that they're supposed to be able to do is to form a corps for when the emperor goes on campaign. So he'll have these units of professional heavy cavalry, and then he can draw up some thematic troops that he raises along the way, and then together they form an army. So what this shows is not only Constantine's concern for security, but also his emphasis on being able to mount offensives on the empire's borders against its foreign foes. So this is a reform which has a twofold impact. And these units, the singular for tagmata is tagma. These tended to be composed of around 2 to 400 men. I'd like to take a look at what was going on in the Arab world during Constantine V's time. Now, if you'll recall, in the summer of 742, Constantine was eager to get to his eastern frontier in order to attack the Umayyad Caliphate. And he had good reason for wanting to attack the Umayyads, since at this time they were fairly disorganized and suffering from a lot of internal tension, and this led to opportunities for the Byzantines to expand and also to raid into Umayyad territory. So let's look at what was going on within the Umayyad Caliphate itself. At this time, the Caliphate was really riven with religious and political tensions, and these tensions boiled over in 750 when the Abbasids revolted against the Umayyad dynasty. It's called the Abbasid Revolution, and this really comes to a head in 750 when the Umayyad family is almost entirely wiped out and the House of Abbas takes control of the Caliphate. Now, because of this civil war and the decision of the Abbasids to relocate the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, Arab concentration will no longer be so heavily directed against the Byzantine Empire. And if you're Constantine V and his successors, that's great news. So, because the Arabs at this time are so busy fighting each other, this means that Constantine V will have an opening to do some damage and make a name for himself. Capitalizing on this Arab weakness, Constantine V mounted at least 3 major eastern campaigns. In 746, he invaded Syria, and he was able to capture his father's hometown of Germanica. He then resettled some of the local Christians in Thrace. There was still an ongoing long-term policy of population relocation. This was to make people more loyal to the emperor than to their locality, and also to repeople the Balkans with people loyal to the Byzantine state. In 747, Byzantine naval forces were able to defeat an Arab fleet off of the island of Cyprus. This was another major victory. Although Constantine V was not present, this would have been really good news for him. This points to the re-expansion of Byzantine naval power all the way into the far reaches of the Eastern Mediterranean, whereas at certain points in the not too distant past, they had been more or less confined to the area around Constantinople, and they had had the Arabs island hop at their expense at one point. So this means that Byzantine power is back in a way that doesn't really get talked about enough. This return of the Byzantine navy to being an offensive force in the Eastern Mediterranean is a pretty big deal, and it's unfortunate that we don't know more details about that. His last major invasion of the Abbasid Caliphate occurred in 752, and during that year he captured Theodosiopolis in Armenia, and he also took the city of Melitene, and he took a lot of captives during that campaign, and he resettled a whole lot of them in the Balkans. After this point, he made peace with the Abbasid Caliphate, and then he focused his attentions westward. Constantine V did shift his attention to the west, but he shifted that attention to the Balkans and not to Italy, where momentous things were happening. In 751, the Lombards finally succeeded in capturing Ravenna, and by taking the capital of Byzantine northern Italy, they effectively ended the Exarchate of Ravenna once and for all. That is a long-term consequence of both Leo III and Constantine V neglecting Italy and embracing iconoclasm, which alienated the Pope and many of their own subjects in Italy. At this point, because the Byzantines were distant, disinterested, and heretical, the Pope felt a lot more comfortable turning to Pepin and the Franks, who he was beginning to see as something other than just another northern barbarian kingdom, and as a real ally. The Franks had the advantage of being Catholic and very unambiguously so, and they also were now powerful enough and willing to get involved on the Pope's behalf in Italy, So at this point, they seemed like a more useful ally. And because the Byzantines under Constantine V and his successors will continue to neglect Italy and not really make all that much of an effort to reconcile with Rome, this relationship between the Franks and the papacy will continue to deepen, and eventually in the year 800, almost 50 years after the fall of Ravenna, and some 25 or so years after the death of Constantine V, we'll see that the Pope crowns a Roman emperor who has no connection at all to the Byzantine Empire, named Charlemagne. And had Constantine V reversed his father's policies in Italy, maybe there would be no Charlemagne. So it's something to think about. This is sort of a long-term repercussion of the policies of the Isaurian dynasty. The fact that Charlemagne was able to take up the title of Roman Emperor. After 755, the primary thing that preoccupied Constantine V was fighting against the Bulgarians in the Balkans. It seems like he had an intention of making war on them from a fairly early date, and he was fortifying his border with Bulgaria when the Bulgar Khan sent an emissary and informed him that this was a violation of a treaty that the two powers had signed back in 716. Constantine V did not desist from his activities, however, and the Bulgar Khan declared war, thus starting an intermittent series of wars between 755 and 775, during the course of which Constantine V led his armies in person about 9 times or so, with the intent of eliminating or reducing the power of Bulgaria. So let's talk more about what Constantine V was doing at the border in 755. It looks like what he was doing is resettling a lot of the Armenians and Syrians who had come with him from his eastern campaigns, and he was putting them along his border with the Bulgars. And for the Bulgar Khan Kormasash, this was an act of war and a violation of the treaty from 716. So, to retaliate and show his displeasure, Kormasash began raiding near Constantinople, but Constantine V came out, met him, and defeated him in battle. And the next year in 756, Constantine decided to go out and seek retribution more thoroughly. So he sent a fleet of about 500 ships to hit the Danube basin. It was supposed to be a bit of a diversion, and then he went overland with his main force and clashed with the Bulgar army at the border fort of Marseille. And at this battle, the Byzantines were successful, and the Bulgarians were forced to send hostages to Constantinople in order to persuade Constantine to call off the invasion and end hostilities before things got even worse for the Bulgarians. In 759, Constantine V decided once again to invade Bulgaria using an overland route. Chances are that he wanted to repeat his success from 756, and that he thought that this was something that was relatively safe to do. However, Khan Vanek had other plans for him, so the Bulgarians barred several possible mountain passes and forced Constantine to rely on just one, the Rishki Pass. And as the Byzantines were passing through this pass, the Bulgarians ambushed them. We don't know the exact numbers, but the Byzantine losses were pretty severe and included the Strategos of Thrace. After this battle, Vanek did not follow up his success, even though he could have, and ultimately this really pissed off the pro-war element in Bulgaria, and it led to the rise of a new Khan named Telets, who took power in 761. The new Bulgarian Khan Telets looted Byzantine territory in 763, and this inspired Constantine V to go out in pursuit. Constantine loaded up about 9,600 cavalry on 800 transports and set out in pursuit. On June 16th, 463, this would lead to the Battle of Anchialus, the greatest battle between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians to this point, and Constantine V's greatest victory over them. The reason why Constantine was able to win this battle is because Telets badly miscalculated. When Constantine and his forces landed, they were on the low ground, and Telets and the Bulgarians occupied the high ground. However, for whatever reason, Telets decided that it was a good idea to abandon the high ground and march down to the lowlands and fight a head-on battle. The result was a bloody slugfest that went from 10 a.m. all the way to sunset and resulted in a decisive but costly Byzantine victory. 2 years later, Toulouse was overthrown for his failures, and that would have been well and good, but Constantine and his heirs really failed to follow up on this victory, and ultimately both sides were able to inflict one big defeat on the other, but neither side was really able to take advantage if we look at the cumulative impact of Rishki Pass and then Anchialus. The Battle of Anchialus in 763 is the last known event in Constantine V's life. However, we do know quite a bit more about his personal life. So, after Irene, the former Khazar princess, died, Constantine V then married a woman named Maria, and when she died, he then married a woman named Eudokia. His eldest son was Leo IV. He was a son of Irene, but Constantine also elevated his sons Nicephorus and Christopher to the rank of Caesar as well. He also had a grandson by Leo IV, whose name was Constantine VI, and he was already about 4 years old in 775 when Constantine V died. So there were essentially 3 generations of Isaurian emperors alive and kicking at the same time for at least 4 years, although Constantine VI had not actually been crowned yet. So that, I think, is kind of a fun fact, especially once you have watched the 2 subsequent videos on Leo IV and Constantine VI. In 775, under circumstances that are far from clear, the new Bulgarian Khan Telerig managed to persuade Constantine V to reveal all of his agents in Bulgaria, and then, contrary to the agreement, Telerig had them all killed. Well, Constantine V was infuriated by this, and he was in the midst of making a new expedition against Bulgaria when he died on campaign on September 14th, 775. If my math is correct, that would make him 57 years old at the time of his death. This is a coin from Khan Telerig, by the way, if you're wondering what this is. Constantine V was able to succeed due to a combination of solid planning, perseverance, and good luck, and the end result of his reign was that he left the empire quite a bit stronger than he found it. His Tagmata reform was an unqualified success. We can tell that by the fact that he was only defeated once that we know of, and that in almost every other battle he was able to emerge victorious. That's a pretty good record, and it speaks not only to his ability as a general, but also to the effectiveness of his military system. However, he is the most reviled emperor in the sources, and that is due to his persecution of the Iconodules, or iconophiles, whichever term you prefer. However, contemporaries seem to have mostly liked Constantine V, and they saw him as a success. And I think that their judgment was right. If you leave the empire stronger than you found it, then you are a success. That being said, the fact that Constantine V was a persecutor is something that, kind of leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Nonetheless, he is an interesting guy, and after his death, we'll see that Byzantium will be hard-pressed to come up with someone of equal worth for quite a long time. Both Leo III and Constantine V can be considered near great emperors. And generally speaking, in any dynasty, once you have a couple of really good emperors in a row, it's time for a bad one. However, Leo IV is something of an exception. Now, while there's a reason why he's not nearly as well remembered as his father and grandfather, it has nothing to do with his ability and everything to do with his ill health and premature death. So, that's why I consider Leo's reign to be something of the epilogue to Constantine V's reign. So, let's take a look at the life and career of Leo IV the Khazar. Let's take a look at Leo IV's early life. Leo was born in 750, and he was the eldest son of Constantine V, but by no means the only son, as we've already seen. Leo's mother was Constantine's first wife. She was a Khazar princess, originally named Tzitzik, but she had taken on the Greek name of Irene. And coincidentally, Irene of Athens would be Leo IV's wife. In 775, when he succeeded his father and became the emperor, Leo was 25 years old, but he already seems to have already had tuberculosis, which is what most people think ultimately caused his death in 780. So even coming into the throne, he was a bit of a marked man, and because of his illness, there were a few people who had designs on the throne. One of the biggest reasons why Leo IV tends to get neglected is the simple fact that we actually don't know all that much about his reign. We do, however, know the broad outline of a few of his military campaigns, the best known of which occurred in 778. That year, Leo IV oversaw a massive invasion of Abbasid Syria. He and his generals won several victories, and they were able to carry away a lot of plunder. After that campaign, when they returned home, there was a parade in Constantinople. It may have been something like a triumph, if that was still an institution that was practiced. There was also a resettlement of Jacobite Christians who lived in Syria, and they were forcibly resettled to Thrace. So Leo IV was continuing the long-standing policy of population resettlement, and this is especially important because the Byzantines are still struggling to really establish a permanent foothold in the Balkans, or at least to expand it. They've had one forever, but it's taking them a long time to recover from the Slavic migration. In 779, the Abbasids launched a retaliatory strike into Asia Minor, but they were defeated by Leo and his generals, so that was another substantial victory. Now in 780, Leo IV was leading a campaign against the Bulgarians, something that his father had done, and just like his father, he ended up dying while on that campaign, and his death occurred in the month of September, and it was from a fever, but most people assume that this fever was ultimately caused by his tuberculosis, or at least exacerbated by it, and that this is when the disease finally claimed his life. In 730, Leo III the Isaurian had instituted iconoclasm, banning the use of icons in religious worship, and then Constantine V later had extended that into a full-fledged persecution starting around 754 or so. And Leo IV will inherit this situation where he has a policy that some people agree with, other people don't, and then there are also a whole lot of people who are uncomfortable with the persecution of people who are iconodules. So Leo IV is more or less a moderate iconoclast. He is his father's son in the sense that he does not believe in the use of icons, and he might see it as idolatrous or something of that nature. However, he doesn't believe in persecuting people, and possibly the reason why he is not comfortable with persecution is because his own wife, Irene of Athens, was an iconodule. So a lot of people have seen, because we know that Irene was a very strong personality and that she was a tireless worker on behalf of the iconodule cause, that she was the key factor in Leo IV ending the persecution. However, from the other evidence we have, namely Leo's success as a general, it seems that he definitely had his own mind and his own will, and that he would not have been someone who would cave easily to pressure. So I would say that she was not all that key to Leo's policy changes, but that she probably was a factor. Anyway, I think a lot of times also because of the shortness of Leo's reign, a lot of people assume that he must not have been all that strong of an emperor, but if you look at his military achievements, as we talked about a little earlier, I think that there's really no reason to think that he wasn't in full command when he was on the throne. When you have a generally healthy and successful emperor, say someone like a Constantine V, the most important family member is usually their son and heir. However, when you have someone who is successful but unhealthy and clearly not going to last for a long time, many other relatives become important as they start to see themselves as part of a possible succession. So let's talk about Leo IV's most important relatives, people who will play a major role in Byzantine politics for the next 20 plus years. First and foremost among these is his wife Irene, pictured here. Irene was an ambitious and beautiful woman who came from Athens, and it's probable that she was selected as his wife for her beauty. Certainly, it seems that Constantine V most likely did not know that she was an iconodule when he allowed Leo to marry her. At least I wouldn't think so, given how strident Constantine was about icons. Leo had a son named Constantine IX, who was 9 years old when he died in 780. Constantine VI will be the official heir to Leo IV, although we'll see that his reign also doesn't quite turn out the way that one would expect. Leo IV had two younger brothers, Nicephorus and Christopher, and both of them had imperial ambitions since they were in their 20s when Leo died, and they had known that Leo was not long for this world ever since he had assumed the throne, and they thought, they had a pretty good chance of going on to succeed their father. It seems that there were people within the state, mostly soldiers, who also agreed that Nicephorus or Christopher could possibly be emperor, and they will cause problems for the government of Constantine and Irene. So between these four Isaurian dynasts, they will really have an impact on history, and three of them, Irene, Nicephorus, and Christopher, most likely would not have really been all that important for subsequent history had Leo IV lived a normal lifespan, if he had managed to make it into his 50s like his grandfather and father. And if that had happened, maybe the only person we would actually know about would be Constantine VI, or maybe we would remember Irene as just being a very attractive empress who was an advocate for the use of icons. So what is the legacy of Leo IV? First of all, I think that we need to exercise a great deal of caution when we look at the relationship between Leo and his wife Irene. A lot of people, because of how prominent Irene became later, and because of the obvious strength of her personality, her intelligence, her ambition, all that stuff, they assume that she dominated her husband the same way that she dominated her son. However, there's really no reason to assume that. We know that Leo IV is someone who was able to campaign and do so successfully. He had some experience by the time he took over for his father. There is no reason to believe that he was anyone's puppet, and had he been fully healthy, there's no reason to believe that he would have been any less great than Leo III or Constantine V. So, one thing that I would say about Leo IV that's pretty significant is that he's the last effective and fully legitimate Isaurian emperor. Constantine VI is fully legitimate, but he was a little bit of an idiot. Irene is effective in many ways in terms of being able to hold on to power, but because she doesn't have much legitimacy after certain events that we'll get to involving the way she treats her son, she's never fully accepted, and most people tolerate her rather than truly following her. So, really, the Isaurian dynasty in its days are numbered once Leo IV dies in September of 780. Another factor that helped to undermine the regency of Constantine under Irene is that when Leo had a confrontation with his brothers Nicephorus and Christopher, he had decided to opt for mercy by not executing them. And this will cause long-term instability as the two of them continue to be focal points for opposition to what is perceived as Irene's rule and eventually becomes just that. It looks like the empire is, or at least was, on a path toward internal peace and external revival under Leo III, Constantine V, and Leo IV, and that path was badly interrupted by Leo's death and the subsequent turmoil and dynastic succession issues that ensued. In 680, Leo IV died and officially left the empire to his son Constantine VI. However, as most people know, Irene, the widow of Leo and the mother of Constantine, was the real power behind the throne, and she was effectively Byzantium's ruler from 680 until 702, with a small interruption in the 690s. However, I would like to talk about that interruption in the 690s and the activities of Constantine VI, who was, technically, the legitimate heir to the Isaurian dynasty. So let's look at his career, and when we've covered it in detail, we'll have a better appreciation of what makes Irene's reign so interesting, and also what enabled it in the first place. So, since we're going to be covering a lot of the same ground in the next two videos, being the ones on Constantine VI and on Irene, my video here on Constantine will cover a lot of what you might call the inside baseball of Byzantine politics, a lot of the palace intrigue, and the relationship between mother and son. Whereas, since Irene was the more serious person in terms of government, we will talk about foreign affairs and domestic affairs in greater detail in my video on Irene, while covering basically the same time period. So let's get into Constantine VI, and hopefully by the time I'm done with this video, you'll understand why I chose Reverse Nero as my subtitle. Let's take a look at the early life of Constantine VI. He was the son of Leo IV and Irene. When Constantine was born in 771, his grandfather and namesake Constantine V was still alive, and young Constantine would have been 4 when his grandfather died. His father, Leo IV, then took over, but he was never well. He had tuberculosis, and he too would die in turn in 780, when Constantine VI was just 9. At this point, Constantine VI became the sole emperor of the Byzantine world, and his mother Irene became his regent. The expectation was clearly that when Constantine VI acquired the age of majority, which would have occurred when he was about 16 or so normally, that he would then start to rule in his own name. However, as we'll see, that didn't quite materialize, and this is the complication which creates interest when it comes to Constantine VI and his mother Irene. By 780, Charlemagne and his Franks held a great deal of influence in Western Europe, including in Italy, and it was clear to Irene that it would be beneficial to arrange a stronger alliance with Charlemagne. So, in 781, she and Charlemagne arranged for an engagement between Constantine and Charlemagne's daughter Rotrud. Constantine at this time would have been about 10, and Rotrud would have been about 6. So, had this marriage been completed, this would have had far-reaching consequences because it would have, on the one hand, legitimated Charlemagne's imperial ambitions, while also shoring up Byzantium's position in Italy, which could only really be threatened by the Carolingians at this point, since only the Carolingians had the military force required to boot the Byzantines from the peninsula. However, as we'll see, this alliance did not end up materializing because Irene broke off the engagement between Constantine and Rotrud. As we'll discuss in greater detail when we cover Irene's life and reign, one of the biggest goals of her entire life was to end iconoclasm. And in 785, she felt like she had consolidated her authority to an extent that would allow her to make such a move. So she and Constantine VI issued a joint letter to Pope Hadrian I calling for a council in Constantinople, which would be explicitly designed to repudiate Constantine V and the practices of iconoclasm. And by repudiate Constantine V, I specifically mean his theology, not his memory, since Irene, of course, drew her legitimacy, and her son also drew his legitimacy from previous Isaurian rulers. Pope Hadrian said that if the imperial pair were to follow his spiritual guidance, then Constantine VI would emerge as the new Constantine the Great, and Irene in her turn would be the new Helena. So this seems like it had the potential to bode well for Constantine's future. If he had such strong support from the papacy, this could really go a long way, combined with his engagement to Rotrud, toward restoring Byzantine prestige in the West. Our first evidence of a rift between mother and son occurred in 787, when Irene, for reasons that we don't know, decided to break off Constantine's engagement to Rotrud. This is something that Constantine still desired, and he was not happy with his mother's decision. Irene then held a bride show, which is sort of a demonstration of various young women of noble families, and she selected a wife for Constantine. Now, in every other bride show that we know about, usually the emperor himself selects, but in this case, the tradition seems to be that Irene chose Constantine's wife. This is also the first known instance of a Byzantine bride show, and I'm not going to go into it, but there actually is a lot of scholarship that suggests that these bride shows were actually a literary invention. However, the fact that they pop up over and over suggests to me that there probably is some truth to these things, and that while we don't fully understand this institution, it most likely was a thing. At any rate, Constantine was now 16, and he was just the right age to resent his mother's decision and to really have a desire to control his own personal life and his destiny more broadly. The bride who was selected for Constantine was Maria of Amnia, who was pious. Most likely, this was something that pleased Irene more than it pleased Constantine. And this broken engagement had quite a few consequences, all of which Irene dealt with since she was still governing in Constantine's name. But one of them, which is a little odd, is that Rotrud was never then promised to anyone else. She never married, and we also have no surviving images of her. So her life is a little bit of a mystery. On the other hand, this broken engagement led to a war between the Franks and the Byzantines in Italy, and the Carolingians managed to capture Istria and Benevento during the course of that war. So, while we don't know Irene's motives, we do know that the consequences were negative. By 790, Constantine VI was 19 years old, and his relationship with his mother was becoming problematic. Normally, an emperor of that age with no physical ailments would take over the reins of government and rule in his own name. Now, maybe his mother would retain some role in the government, but she certainly would not be running the whole show, and certainly would not be issuing decrees in her own name or anything of that nature. However, Irene was a very special and very strong person. And rather than handing over control of the government to Constantine, Irene basically wanted to keep things the way that they were, and not only that, but then confirm her status in a way that would effectively move her son to the side. So her plan was not only to take up an imperial title, which would be an unprecedented thing since the title she wanted was Basileus, the masculine form of emperor. So not only did she want that title, but she also wanted seniority over her son. So she wanted to be the senior Basileus and effectively be the person controlling the empire, with her son there as a second. Now, if you're Constantine VI, this would be something that would thoroughly emasculate you and would make you seem weak, incompetent, and pathetic in the eyes of your peers. For a lot of people, especially elites in the army, their loyalty had been to the Isaurian dynasty, meaning the people who are the descendants of Leo III, Constantine V, and Leo IV, not to their various wives. Not to mention that there had never been a ruling empress before in the way that Irene envisioned. So there is quite a bit of controversy from the get-go. And Constantine was determined to take power in his own name to save face, if nothing else. It's even possible that maybe she came up with this plan because she knew her son wasn't even all that interested in governing. We don't know all the details, obviously. So Constantine formed a conspiracy with iconoclasts who were anti-Irene after she had managed to get the icons restored. And basically Constantine played up his heritage as being the descendant of 3 different iconoclast emperors, and he and his followers aimed at banishing Irene to Sicily, where she couldn't cause them any grief. However, Irene was astute and aware, and she managed to catch this coup in its early phases. She had Constantine imprisoned, and then she demanded an oath of allegiance from Constantine, where he would basically cede the seniority that she asked for and agree to be personally loyal to her and respect her authority. Irene made a couple of mistakes when she tried to assert herself as the senior emperor, not least of which was that she massively underestimated the degree to which there were still iconoclasts who were angry with her about how she had more or less rammed icon restoration down their throats with her council in 787. something that I'll talk about more when I get to the life of Irene. So she did have strong support in the capital and in Europe, but the armies of Asia Minor were still largely iconoclast and had been a bastion of strength for the Isaurian emperors for 4 generations now, and they had no intention of breaking away from Constantine VI. There was a revolt in favor of Constantine in the Armeniacan theme, and Constantine was able to break out of prison and join the rebel army in Anatolia, which also implies that he had enough support within the city to get someone to help him break out. And then once he joined this rebel army, he was able to return to Constantinople and then take control. Remember, one key factor here is that Byzantium's military power is quite a bit stronger in Asia Minor than it is in Europe. So if there were to be a battle between those two forces, the outcome is almost predetermined. And I don't think that very many generals in Europe would have been foolhardy enough to try to fight a battle on behalf of a cause that didn't really have a lot of legal precedent and was unpopular with the majority of the army. In 790, after 10 years of only being titular emperor, Constantine VI was now in full possession of the Byzantine realm that was his inheritance. So let's look at the moves that he made to consolidate power. First of all, he obviously had to deal with his mother Irene. So she was stripped of her rank and then confined to the palace that she had designed at Eleutherius. So it was house arrest, but it wasn't particularly harsh, since this was a very nice palace and it was brand new. He also had to deal with Irene's chief adherent, Stariakis, who was her logothete. So Stariakis was flogged and then banished to the Armeniacan theme, where Constantine had plenty of supporters to keep a lookout on him. Several of Irene's other partisans were similarly dealt with. If we had followed the account of John Julius Norwick, pictured here, then he interprets Constantine's moves during this time as being made by his military backers, and Constantine himself as being relatively unimportant in these moves. However, since these moves were relatively obvious, I don't think that there's any reason to doubt that Constantine could have thought of these things for himself, even if, as we'll see, he's not the most brilliant emperor that Byzantium ever had. By the end of the year, he's not only in charge, he's dealt with his enemies, but he's also highly popular, because remember, the Isaurian regime by this point was pretty well established, and they had quite a bit of popularity with the population as a whole. Another side note about John Julius Norwick, he is an interesting historian in the sense that he is an engaging writer, even if he tends to be more than a little inaccurate in a lot of places. But the main reason why I decided to put his picture here is because he looks a lot like the nature boy Ric Flair in this particular photo, and I couldn't help but think that it would be really interesting to read a history book written by Ric Flair, maybe a history of North Carolina or something like that. And I just couldn't find another place to work in that joke, so I decided to just shove it in right here. So there you go, Ric Flair's History of North Carolina, coming to a bookstore near you. So before we go through the catalog of Constantine's failures that led to his deposition and blinding, I would first like to talk about his reign in general terms, in terms of his capacity as a ruler, his ability to actually govern in a general sense. It appears from everything that I can gather that Constantine was someone who was not talented at governance in any way. Once he's in power, Constantine VI was weak, indecisive, and easily persuaded. He had a reputation that you never want as being the person who was always convinced by the last person he had spoken to, and really didn't have the ability to think critically or think for himself. So it's possible that maybe Irene was right to want to seize power because she knew that her son would be terrible as a ruler. And maybe her motives were not quite as dark as they're often portrayed by a lot of people who just take for granted that she was evil and power hungry. At any rate, one of Constantine's other great faults is that he had no real ability to strategize when it came to choosing allies. So he would get the support of one group and then not realize what they would construe as betrayal and go out and do something that would alienate that group without ever actually winning over the new group he was trying to court. We'll see that in action and you'll understand what I'm talking about. He also was elevated by the iconoclast, but he never actually took up the icon issue, or at least he didn't so far as I'm aware. I think he flirted with the issue, and he did threaten the patriarch with banning the icons once again, but ultimately he didn't really act, and his conduct on the issue by talking about possibly going back to iconoclasm without actually doing anything ended up leaving both sides dissatisfied with his conduct. I can't really think of very many emperors who have squandered more political capital and goodwill in a shorter amount of time. It looks like most people wanted him to succeed. They felt like he had been wronged by his mother and that he had been underestimated. And basically, all he did as emperor is prove that she was right to try to take power away from him, that he really just wasn't fit for office. The only consistent support base that he never fully lost were the armies of Asia Minor, and ultimately, even they were not enough to save him from himself. The number one way that incompetent emperors get exposed is through military disasters, because never is an emperor's ability more on display than when they are leading men into battle. And it was long the tradition of Byzantium that emperors would command in person when there was a major crisis. So let's look at how Constantine VI's performance as a field commander really started to cause his reign to unravel. So, in 791, Arab forces were able to invade Constantine's eastern frontier, and they defeated his eastern armies. It looks like Constantine was not personally present for that campaign. However, the only way to resolve the issue ended up being accepting a treaty that many people found humiliating. So that definitely dampened his prestige quite a bit. And in 792, there was a renewed Bulgarian threat, and this time Constantine did take the field in person. Now, most likely, the Bulgarians attacked because they thought of Constantine as being weak after what had happened in the east. And he wanted to reverse that impression, so he led his army out in person. At the Battle of Marseille in 792, Constantine VI ended up being heavily defeated by the Bulgarians under Khan Kardam, and so far as I'm aware, this is basically the only thing that Khan Kardam is really famous for. And, he got lucky and happened to face one of the more incompetent Byzantine emperors in an open battle, so good for him. Following his double set of defeats on both frontiers, Constantine VI had a prestige problem, and he was searching for new allies. So he decided to turn to family for help, and he decided to reconcile with his mother Irene. So not only did he bring her back and restore her to favor, but he also confirmed her title of Basileus, although she would be the junior emperor, not the senior, and she would not be the person making decisions. The person making decisions would be Constantine. The main problem with this was not so much putting in place someone who was ambitious, but rather that his chief support base in the capital, the iconoclast, saw this as a complete and total betrayal. After all, Irene to them was the worst person in the world. She had campaigned relentlessly to get the icons restored, and they had risked their lives to get Constantine put in charge and to banish Irene just a couple years before. And now he was undoing everything that they had fought for. And not only that, but he was giving her more official institutionalized authority than she had ever had before. So now their enemy was confirmed as a potential emperor. And were, say, Constantine to die of a massive heart attack at random, then Irene would be full emperor, not just regent or anything like that. So they were really angry, and they thought that their chances of enacting their religious policy going forward had been completely dashed. So at this point, they wondered, why did they support Constantine at all, since he probably was not going to ban the icons again if his mother was in office. So, one thing that Constantine had to do after he recalled Irene was to suppress a revolt by former supporters in the east. A bunch of Armenians revolted against him, possibly because of this icon issue and because they were opponents of Irene. And not only did he suppress this revolt, but he did so with considerable brutality, and that didn't sit well with the other supporters who were now having their doubts. After dealing with the Armenian revolt, it appears that Constantine VI thought that his house was more or less in order and that it was time to deal with an affair a little bit more private. So, by 794, he had grown tired of his wife Maria, who he had never really wanted in the first place, so far as we're aware, assuming, of course, that Irene was in fact the person who picked her. And the problem with Maria is that she seems to have been barren. She had not borne him any children. And if you're an emperor, then one of your primary goals is to ensure a line of succession. And especially if you're an Asarian emperor, you know that you probably won't live beyond your late 50s. So it's a good idea to try to sire offspring early and often, if you can. So Constantine VI decided that the only course of action was to divorce his wife Maria and remarry. And the woman he chose to remarry was his longtime mistress Theodote. So in late 794, he divorced Maria and then married his mistress early the next year. So you think that this is actually a fairly rational move. And it is, because you have to ensure the succession. That's one of the most important jobs of any emperor. However, the problem is that divorce under church law at this time was illegal, and this act technically counted as adultery, or mikia, hence why this is known as the Mikian controversy. The problem here is that now the group that he will alienate are the monks of Byzantium. So when he and his mother had restored the icons, they had gained the favor of this group. And you might think that monks are not all that important of a power base. However, they have quite a bit of influence with the populace, and monks are men who, are very fervent about their religious beliefs, and they could cause physical problems as well. We know in an earlier century that there were monks who were burning down pagan temples in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, for instance. So, alienating monks, if you can avoid it, is never a good idea. And the thing is, though, that the monks, while they abandoned their support of Constantine, that did not mean that they abandoned their support of Irene, who was still a pro-icon hero. So, by engaging in this behavior, what Constantine did is give his mother an opening to seize full control, because now she has a base of support that wants exactly that. And because of this, and because a lot of scholars tend to interpret Irene as being this evil opportunist, they tend to think that his marriage plans were actually encouraged by Irene and that she was launching a long-term master scheme. I don't know if she was behind this at all, or if she was just forced to go along with it. I actually don't know if she was loyal to her son at this point or not. I don't confess to know any of those things, but what I will say is that in the long run, this is something that did end up working out in her favor. One thing that I haven't mentioned in this video to this point is that Constantine had a number of living uncles who were potential threats to his throne, but up to this point they had been more or less placid and they hadn't caused any issues for either Constantine or Irene. However, there was a plot by Constantine's uncle Nicephorus, and this plot was detected by Constantine. So Constantine at this point seems to have known that his regime was in trouble, and he acted with brutality. He had Nicephorus blinded, and then, as a precaution, he had his 4 other uncles gathered together and had their tongues removed. So that way they wouldn't be able to persuade people to follow them, and they would be, in theory, unable to rule. Now, this act ultimately just made him look cruel, paranoid, and untrustworthy. After all, these other 4 uncles had never done Constantine any harm, and they had had plenty of opportunities to do so. By this point, we're in about the year 795, and Constantine had been on the throne since 780. These other 4 uncles had done him no harm whatsoever. So if you're any other official, then you might think that Constantine is on the verge of instituting a reign of terror. After all, if one of his uncles can't trust him, then why should you, as a Byzantine official, trust him? It's also possible, according to the people who really want to promote the evil, scheming Irene narrative, that she was the person who urged Constantine to act brutally, knowing that this would alienate people and cause a clamoring for her to take power, while also rendering Constantine's uncles unable to take power. Again, though, I am somewhat skeptical of that narrative, although the evidence in this case is not really abundant enough to prove or disprove all that much about Irene's intentions. So back in 791 and 792, the beginning of the unraveling of Constantine VI's regime occurred because of his military failures, and it's only fitting that his regime should completely come unglued because of yet another military failure. So, in 797, Constantine VI took the field in person, and his goal was to combat the invading Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid in his eastern provinces, Harun being pictured here. So, the thing is, for whatever reason, and it's kind of hard to imagine how this happened, Constantine ended up coming home prematurely, supposedly because he had received false intelligence that the Caliph had withdrawn his forces beyond the frontier, thus meaning that the invasion was over. However, it appeared that actually this report was false, and that Harun's forces were still laying waste to Byzantine territory while the emperor had withdrawn his troops back to the capital. And you can imagine that this was a humiliation to top all humiliations. Some people have speculated that Irene may have been the source of this false intelligence report because she knew that it would thoroughly delegitimize her son and alienate his last remaining support base, the armies of Asia Minor. And if that were the case, then this would be the most effective way that I've really encountered in Byzantine history to really delegitimate somebody. Because that was his last support base, were the armies of Asia Minor. So at a blow, he managed to prove himself to be incompetent and unworthy to the local Tagmata in the capital, who would be with him always, and to the thematic armies of Asia Minor, which were mobilized under him and then abandoned to face the Caliph by themselves. So, all in all, this was a complete and total catastrophe for Constantine. But once again, I don't know whether his mother was actually the source of this report or not. It's also possible that there was another failure somewhere else in the system. And as we'll see, one of Irene's policies when she was in charge was to massively cut funding to the military, and that could have caused some of the problems that made it hard for Constantine to get things done. So it may have been an indirect result that was unintentional. At any rate, one thing that the Byzantines were not really willing to tolerate was a coward, and this was the final straw when it came for most people dealing with Constantine. Shortly after Constantine's premature abandonment of the season's campaign, in June of 797, while Constantine was riding around the city, Irene and her partisans struck. He was ambushed within the city, but then he managed to flee successfully across the Bosporus, and there he thought that he would find support. After all, in the past, the armies of Asia Minor had always come to his defense. In this case, however, he didn't have time to rally these forces to his aid, as Irene's partisans were able to quickly follow up and arrest him before he was able to get much done. At that point, he was returned to the city, and then in August, he was officially deposed and then blinded, thus leaving Irene as the sole emperor of Byzantium. We don't know exactly when Constantine VI died. It's most likely wasn't all that long after his deposition and blinding in August of 797, and it certainly was not later than 805. And most likely, as with many people who got blinded at that time, the cause of his death was an infection or some other complication from the blinding process. In addition, he had had a young son by his second wife Theodote. However, that son had actually died prior to Constantine being deposed and blinded. So at this point, the hands of the empire and the fate of this dynasty now lie entirely with a middle-aged woman with no heir and no grandson either. So this will create something of a problem going forward that we'll explore more fully when we look at Irene. Despite the fact that he is far from the most talented of Byzantium's rulers, Constantine VI actually has a legacy, albeit not a very positive one. So, one thing that you can learn from Constantine is that if you're going to try to do something controversial, like, say, divorce your wife and remarry in a society where that is considered adultery, then you might want to make sure that you're a talented ruler before you try that, since people are more willing to give some leeway to people who actually perform, whereas they're much harsher critics of people who don't really bring much else to the table. So, in many ways, his Mechian controversy is just a demonstration of his inability to perform politically in other arenas. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine that it would have raised quite that much stink. Another thing is that we think of his mother Irene as being a historical figure, and I think that that's correct. There are no other ruling Byzantine empresses that I'm aware of, and certainly none of them were anywhere near as influential as Irene. However, for her to manage to seize power and have so much influence and take up the title of Basileus, there had to be a circumstance which enabled it, and that circumstance is, in a word, Constantine himself. First, he was too young to rule, so she was able to exercise power as regent. And then, when he grew up to be a less than ideal candidate for the job, she was able to make a strong case to enough people that she should rule instead of her son. So, without Constantine growing up to be inept, it's hard to imagine how his mother would have achieved power. The fact that Constantine VI had no living heirs when he died really spelled doom for the Isaurian dynasty. Otherwise, Irene could have ruled in the name of a child and possibly had a stronger claim to power, lasted longer, and then passed on the throne to another generation. However, because Constantine was not successful in having children, this really posed a problem for the long-term health of his dynasty. And because he was sort of cloistered away after his blinding, and we don't even know exactly when he died, this meant that there was still a lot of doubt about whether or not he was dead. And even as late as the 820s, a rebel named Thomas the Slav rose up claiming to be Constantine, and he used that claim in order to gain support. So Constantine, while we think of him as being a complete failure, he apparently did still have a support base, or at least there were people who were loyal enough to his dynasty and that they were willing to go out and fight for someone claiming to be him, even on such a spurious and implausible ground. So, anyway, though that is the legacy of Constantine VI, and in my next video we'll look at Irene and get the other side of the picture for this period after 780. Today we're going to be discussing the career of the Empress Irene, who officially reigned from 797 until 802, but in point of fact was effectively the ruler of the Byzantine world from about 780 to 802, with a brief interruption between about 790 and 797. And Irene is a figure of great controversy, and the main claim to fame for Irene is that she is Byzantium's first and only reigning Basilissa, meaning female Basileus. So let's look at her life and explore exactly why she is such a figure of controversy. Let's look at Irene's origins and early life. Irene was a noble orphan from Athens, born around the year 750. Her uncle or cousin, it's not really clear which, Constantine Psarantippicus, was a patrician and possibly also served as the strategos of the Hellas theme at the end of the 8th century. The reason and method of her selection as Leo's wife is not clear. Norwick thinks that it was because of her beauty, and he makes some sort of argument that Athens was no longer an intellectual hub, but again, Norwick sometimes just kind of shoots from the hip and makes things up as he goes, so let's not take that too seriously. Irene married the future Leo IV in late 768 and gave birth to the future Constantine VI in 771. One source of debate about Irene and her life is the degree to which she held influence over her husband Leo IV. So Irene was always an iconophile. She always wanted to end iconoclasm, but her husband and his family were the chief iconoclast of the empire. After all, it had been Leo IV's grandfather who had originally banned the icons, and Leo's father, Constantine V, was the chief thinker of the iconoclast movement. He was a great theologian in his own right. So, Irene definitely had an uphill battle. Now, when Leo IV took over in 775, he quickly ended some of his father's more extreme measures when it came to enforcing iconoclasm. He ended the outright persecution of iconodules and sort of returned to the policies of his grandfather, where his policies were against icons, not the people who worshipped icons. Many scholars have speculated that this was due to Irene's influence, and as evidence, they've cited her later control over her son, and also the fact that Leo IV was not a very healthy individual, and that he probably needed someone to lean on. However, I think that it's far too easy to assume that Irene controlled Leo IV, especially when we don't really have any evidence for this. We also know, for instance, that despite the fact that Leo IV was not a healthy individual, he was still an active man. He commanded troops in the field. So it's unlikely that he would have been someone who is weak enough to be manipulated to the extent that some scholars imagine. And also, I think, and we'll get into this as we go along, that maybe the degree to which Irene is seen as a master manipulator gets blown out of proportion to reality once in a while. There's another story about that Leo IV decided to crack down on icon users in August of 780, and that he had turned against Irene and refused to share a bed with her, but then died in September. And because of that story, some scholars speculate that he had been under her influence and then had broken away, and then she had somehow had him murdered. Although we also know that he had had something like tuberculosis ever since he had taken office, and it's not really that surprising that he ended up dying while on campaign and exerting himself if he was sickly. When Leo IV died in September of 780, Irene was named as regent to her 9-year-old son, Constantine VI. The army in Asia Minor at this time was heavily iconoclast, and they had some interest in supporting one of Leo's 5 brothers, since they didn't feel comfortable with the idea of the empire being governed by a regent who was a woman. As an iconophile, Irene knew that she would have to move very cautiously, since she had very few allies within the army or the church, both of which were dominated by iconoclasts, which isn't surprising given that there had been 3 iconoclast emperors in a row. So since Irene couldn't just go forward and restore the icons, she decided to proceed with caution. From day one, Irene began to make slow progress toward removing iconoclasts and people who might potentially support one of her brothers-in-law, and she began to replace them with men who were personally loyal to her. And kudos to anyone who understands why Tom Perez is on this slide. In my previous video on Constantine VI, I refrained from talking about all of the things that happened under his reign when he wasn't actually exercising power, since all of those decisions were actually made by his mother, the regent Irene. So now let's talk about Irene's conduct as regent and look beyond just her role in dealing with the iconoclasm controversy. So, in 780, Irene faced her first crisis when Sicily revolted. In 780, she had appointed Elpidius to be the governor of Sicily, and then early the next year, Elpidius revolted and favored Leo's brother Nicephorus and tried to back him for the throne. So, in response, Irene then took Elpidius' wife and children hostage and tried to recall Elpidius to the capital. However, he refused, so then she upped the ante by having his family publicly whipped, and he still refused. So Irene had to send an expedition to get rid of Elpidius. She dispatched a fleet under the patrician Theodore, and he left in either late 781 or early 782, and he was able to win and defeat Elpidius after fighting several battles. Then Elpidius was still enough in command of the area to take the treasury and flee to Abbasid lands. And now he made a formal claim to the throne of Byzantium, and he would serve as an advisor to the caliphs as late as 802, which I think is the last time that he is attested. And I want to say he also took part in a couple of campaigns that occurred in Asia Minor when he accompanied some of the Abbasid armies. So Elpidius was dealt with, but he still posed a threat, and the Abbasids used him as something of a puppet and a tool. Not long afterward, another war between Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate broke out on the eastern frontier in Asia Minor when the Caliph's son Harun al-Rashid crossed the eastern border with 100,000 men. At this time, the Armenian general Tatzades decided to defect with his entire army to the Abbasid side, which then left the Byzantines in a very precarious situation. So to deal with this problem, the hard-pressed Irene was forced to buy off Harun with an expensive truce, and then agreed to pay an annual tribute of 70,000 gold dinars for the next 3 years. For obvious reasons, this was something that did not settle well with most citizens of the empire, and it was viewed as a failure on her part. Whether fairly or unfairly is largely beside the point. In 783, Irene was in need of a victory, and her general Staurakius managed to deliver one for her. So that year, she dispatched her top supporter, the eunuch Staurakius, to Greece, and he was able to win the only great victory of Irene's entire reign. So Staurakius was able to put down the Slavs in Macedonia and Thessaly, and then make a deep raid into the still unsubdued Peloponnese, and return loaded down with plunder. This is also part of a very long process of the Byzantines reasserting their control of the Balkan Peninsula. They hadn't really controlled this area since the about middle of the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, and it would still be a while before Irene's successors were able to really bring the area under full authority of the Byzantine Empire again, but this is one of the many, many steps in that process. By 784, Irene now felt confident enough to push forward her own candidate for the Patriarch See and begin her campaign in earnest to restore the icons. So she decided to elect Tarasius to the Patriarch See, and that was a controversial decision. Tarasius was an imperial secretary, and he had never held an ecclesiastical office and was not even ordained. So Irene managed to push Tarasius through, and he was able to receive his ordination, and then after about a month or month and a half or something like that, he was then confirmed as the new patriarch. What this does is it sets a precedent for the politician versus zealot debate that occurred later, and that debate, to put it as simply as possible, was one of whether we should allow expediency in the service of good, or whether you should have to stick to the strict traditions and rules of the church no matter what. And this would be a huge dispute among monks and other ecclesiastical figures. And like I said, it will take a little while to emerge, but definitely the irregular election of Tarasius will give a lot of inspiration to the people who will be known as the politician faction in later ages. As soon as Tarasius was confirmed as patriarch, he and Irene began to prepare for a synod to restore icons. Tarasius planned very carefully, and he only invited delegates who were in favor of restoring the icons. The council that he called opened on August 17th of 786 in the Church of the Holy Apostles. However, this council was broken up by iconoclast soldiers, and this was especially troubling to the papal delegation, which had not anticipated this level of violence, and there was some danger that the papal delegation would not return for a second round. And now Tarasius and Irene are scrambling and trying to set up a second council so that they can get this done. It ended up taking Irene and Tarasius about 13 months to reconvene their council meeting. So, in order to get rid of the troops who had broken into the church and broken up the council, Irene decided to declare a new campaign in the east a few weeks after the council was broken up in 786, and as soon as the men were in the field, she had the guilty parties quietly disbanded and then replaced them with men who were more trustworthy from Bithynia, so men who presumably would not engage in mutinous behavior. When the delegates reconvened in September of 787, Irene took the additional precaution of having them meet in Nicaea at the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Nicaea was a smaller city and would be less prone to things like rioting, and it would also have a smaller garrison, so it would be less likely that you would have troops there who would mutiny or break up the meeting in the name of defending iconoclasm. Now, just like the first time, this was a council where the outcome was basically predetermined. There was no debate on the issue of iconoclasm, only how to deal with iconoclast. And ultimately, this decision came down as follows. The idea was that iconoclast bishops would be allowed to keep their sees so long as they released a public recantation, and that really infuriated the monastic faction, which was calling for their excommunication. If you'll recall, the monks were instrumental in saving a lot of icons from destruction, and they had a visceral hatred of the iconoclast faction. So, they were upset by this decision, but as you might imagine, the will of the bishops was a great deal more important than the will of the monks when it came to any kind of formal church council. So, not surprisingly, the bishops got their way, and they moved forward with a more conciliatory policy that would be less likely to cause problems, and the monks, who were really zealous, were sort of left in the lurch a bit. Having restored the icons, Irene was riding high, and she decided to engage in more high-handed action, this time at the expense of her son, the Emperor Constantine VI. So back in 781, Irene had arranged for Constantine to become engaged to Rotrud, and she had even dispatched Greek instructors to teach the Frankish princess the proper language of the Eastern Empire. However, for reasons that are unknown, Irene ended the engagement in 787. That same year, she decided to hold a bride show for her son, and it seems like she selected Maria of Amnia to become Constantine's new wife. Now, Constantine VI, by this point, was nearing adulthood, and he was not pleased by the cancellation of his betrothal to Rotrud and his mother's domineering intervention in his personal life. And this seems to have been the start of the troubles between them, which would later blossom into things that we'll talk about. Of more immediate consequence than the growing rift between mother and son, however, was the reaction of Charlemagne, who was at this point the most powerful man in Europe. Charlemagne was understandably upset with Irene's rash decision to break off the engagement between Constantine and Rotrud, and in 788 Charlemagne attacked Byzantine holdings in Italy. Several key cities fell to the Franks, and it was a pretty big setback for Byzantine interest in Italy. Rotrud never went on to marry anyone else after her betrothal was broken off, and this is actually in keeping with what happened to her sisters as well. Charlemagne did not allow his daughters to officially marry or have legitimate children because he already had 4 legitimate sons, and the birth of any cadet branches of the family would most likely lead to more civil wars and require that the empire be divided into yet more parts. It was still Frankish tradition to divide the empire between the living sons of a monarch, and Charlemagne knew that the more sons and legitimate heirs that he produced, the more fragmented his legacy would become. So he tried to limit that by preventing his daughters from marrying. So if you're wondering why Rotrud never had any children and what happened to her, this is what happened. She did probably have an unofficial husband and seemed to have some unofficial kids. Charlemagne was apparently very fond of his illegitimate grandchildren, but at any rate, that's a different story for a different day. Speaking of family matters, Irene's relationship with Constantine would now reach a breaking point. By 790, the 19-year-old Constantine VI was ready to rule in his own name, and most of the time it was customary for a regent to step aside when a young emperor was about 16 to 18, and then let that emperor rule in his own name. So Constantine VI was due to take over, and he was presumably growing pretty restless with his mother's continued dominance. It also must have embarrassed him due to the norms of a society that was completely male-dominated. But Irene decided to move in the exact opposite direction from what most people would have expected. She actually decreed that she should take precedence over Constantine as the senior ruler and that her name should appear first on decrees. Well, Constantine VI was not pleased by that, and neither were the people who now supported him and wanted to get rid of Irene. As you might imagine, the main people who were pissed off at Irene were the iconoclasts, who still saw her restoration of the icons as a kind of sleazy, fly-by-night council, which wasn't legitimate because of the way that it had been handled and the lack of an actual debate over the merits of icons. So, Constantine VI was at the head of this conspiracy to depose his mother, and most of his supporters were iconoclast, and their aim was actually to banish Irene to Sicily. And I suppose there's a certain amount of irony there, since Sicily had revolted against Irene early on during her regency, and maybe this was seen as a subtle form of punishment and insult. At any rate, though, Irene was quick to the draw, and she detected the plot and had her son jailed, and then she demanded an oath of loyalty to herself from her son and all of his followers. However, this didn't end up solving the problem, as it turns out that Constantine VI actually had more political support than his mother due to his membership in the Isaurian dynasty. By trying to become the senior ruler at the expense of her son, who was the rightful holder of the throne, and by trying to extract an oath of loyalty, Irene had badly overreached, and the army of Asia Minor, which was heavily iconoclast, moved into Constantinople and restored Constantine VI as the sole ruler of the empire. At this time, Irene was confined to her palace at Eleutherius, which I believe was a new place that she had built herself, and she was more or less under house arrest from 790 to 792, and during that time she was deprived of her title of Basilissa. And by any reasonable expectations, this should have been the end of her career. Most of the time, when a female regent steps aside and an adult, healthy son takes power, we don't really hear all that much from the mother after that point. However, Irene was not your typical female regent, and she would be back, and she would be back very forcefully in the near future. When he first overthrew his mother in 790, Constantine VI was very popular, and people were hopeful for the future. Here was a young emperor now back in control. He had dealt with the irregularity that his mother had attempted, and now things would get back to normal, and Byzantium would have a strong male ruler. Well, not quite. So as soon as he took power, it was pretty clear that Constantine VI was not a very talented ruler. In just 2 short years, he managed to suffer 2 military reverses on both major fronts against the Arabs in the east and then the Bulgars in the west, and his prestige was running dangerously low. So his response was to look for potential allies. And since he was sort of playing a dangerous game when it came to courting iconoclast and iconophiles, he decided to appeal to the monastic faction by playing to his mother. Now, his mother was someone who was very popular with the monks, and Constantine restored her position and title in 792, and he thought that thereby he would gain an ally and get the monks off his back. However, in the event, it also alienated the iconoclasts who had supported him in the first place, as they did not want Irene anywhere near power and they felt betrayed. So while it sort of made sense at first, it really alienated his key support base, and it was actually a pretty inept move to restore his mother to power. It was very clear from the evidence that during the 5-year period from 792 to 797 that Constantine VI is very much still in the driver's seat as the senior imperial actor, and that his mother was at best the junior ruler and possibly even just a counselor, and not really someone who was actually exercising authority in an open or direct way. Over the 5-year period from 792 to 797, Constantine VI continued to make moves, almost all of which undermined his popularity, and the one thing that really stands out is when he behaved with excessive cruelty toward his 4 uncles, and then engaged in the Medicean controversy where he divorced his wife Marie of Amnia and remarried, which under church law at the time constituted adultery. And in terms of this act of cruelty towards his uncles, he had had 1 uncle try to revolt, and in response he had taken 4 uncles who were uninvolved and had their tongues ripped out. and this made him look disloyal since those uncles had never caused him any grievance before that point. So, because of Constantine's failure and how things ended up turning out between mother and son, some scholars have tried to view Irene as a Machiavellian advisor who deliberately steered her son toward doom so that she could seize power for herself. And we do know that she was loved by the monastic faction and that she would engage in intrigue if it helped her. But if she did undermine her son, then that was probably something that she only started to do late during that 5-year period, after it became clear that his days were numbered. I don't think that she had some sort of grand plot from the very beginning to undermine Constantine. I think that she was just happy to probably be restored in any capacity at all, and then as it became clear that her son was a complete failure, she decided to abandon him and go her own way, and then try to fulfill her old ambition of ruling in her own name. So that's sort of my take on it, but it's kind of hard to know since the evidence is a little unclear, and of course the sources are deeply biased against Irene since she's an ambitious woman in the Middle Ages. Up to this point, if you weren't familiar with Irene's story before watching this video, you're probably wondering why she's one of the most infamous figures in Byzantine history. Well, now that mystery is about to be resolved. So, in 797, Constantine VI took the field against Caliph Harun al-Rashid. He had succeeded his father, but for whatever reason, Constantine VI had retired to the capital before the Caliph had left Byzantine territory, and that made him look really cowardly, and it completely undermined whatever credibility he had left. So then in June of 797, Irene's men ambushed Constantine while he was riding through the streets of Constantinople, and he was able to flee to the east, and he was trying to gather his forces, but then he was captured before he could really gather anyone to support him. The captured Constantine was formally deposed and then blinded in August, and that left Irene as the sole holder of imperial authority. So the fact that she overthrew and blinded her son is why Irene is such a controversial and infamous figure in Byzantine history. So now that we've established the facts of how Irene deposed her son Constantine, let's look into some possible explanations for why she did what she did. Well, we know, for starters, that she was clearly power-hungry and ambitious. She had tried to claim the title of senior emperor over her own son, despite the fact that no mother had ever been able to do that, and that she was not the daughter of a previous ruler, but rather a daughter-in-law. So, it was kind of a weird step for her to take, and it is only really explicable if you look at her as being ambitious beyond what we've seen in the past. It's also possible, and if we look at the evidence, it's clear that her son was pretty incompetent, that she saw her son as unfit for the throne and believed that she was acting in the best interest of the empire by removing her son from power and replacing him with herself. She may have legitimately believed that she was a more fit ruler than Constantine. However, as we'll see, I don't know if she's really that much better. So, maybe she did have that mistaken belief, however, since there are a lot of parents who do believe that their kids are a lot worse than they actually are, and they just have a general sense of disappointment with their children, even when it's not quite justified. But at any rate, what we can say is that in ancient and medieval text, there's always a deep suspicion of any woman who has an ambition for power, and that's really the main reason why there's such a heavy bias against her, and a tendency to assume the absolute worst about her. And because that bias is present, that's why so many modern accounts of Byzantine history make Irene out to be the real boogeyman. While it's possible that she just did this in the name of power and she didn't really care about the morality of the act, I think that in her own mind she probably had some reason for doing what she did, even if that reason was not very well thought out or wouldn't really make sense to anyone else. So that's sort of my thought on the overthrow of Constantine. So let's make a quick side note about terminology. So, sometimes people report that Irene held the title of Basileus, which is the male-gendered word for emperor. However, In point of fact, she used the title Basilissa, which is the female version. There are only 3 coins that call Irene the Basileus, and because those 3 coins are so rare, it's possible it was just merely a misprint at one of the mints. The title that she really used the most, as I mentioned, was Basilissa. And I would also like to point out to any pedants out there that the reality of her power was the same either way. So let's not focus too much on something that is kind of just a trivial side note. Moving on. When she became sole ruler in 797, Irene found herself in a precarious position, and it's really amazing that she managed to last 5 years given how weak her position truly was. So, first of all, Constantine's deposition was incredibly unpopular, and the army of Asia Minor came very close to mutinying in favor of their now blind favorite. Remember, the army of Asia Minor was still deeply iconoclast and had supported the Isaurian dynasty since the days of Leo III, all the way back starting in 717. So, for them to support Constantine VI despite his ineptitude was not all that surprising, since that is the kind of thing they had been doing for 80 years at this point. As for Irene herself, when dealing with foreign policy, she was also seen as vulnerable by the Abbasids. So, in order to keep the Abbasids at bay, Irene decided to pay a larger tribute than the one that her son had already agreed to, following his beating at the hands of the Abbasids. And this was just to avoid another conflict in the east that she didn't think she could win. So if you are a member of the Byzantine army, you probably look at this as a slap in the face, since you hadn't been defeated again, but yet your ruler was now increasing the tribute to a foreign power that you hadn't had a chance to defeat in several years. However, Irene's strategy was to appease the wealthy elite and hope for the best. So she tried to appeal to all of the major players in the Byzantine state with large tax remissions of all kinds, including ending the tax on receipts, which was unpopular, and ending the municipal levy of Constantinople altogether. She also halved the vital customs duties that were collected at ports. So this was a way to keep people happy enough that they didn't want to overthrow her. After all, they stood to gain in their personal financial situation from having her on the throne, even if they thought that she was a horrible person and a completely incompetent ruler. However, as you might imagine, this was not really a sustainable situation, and things would deteriorate from here. Despite the fact that Irene was able to rule for 5 years, she was never able to rule effectively. So let's look at the reasons why she wasn't able to be an effective ruler. First of all, she had 2 main supporters, the eunuchs Dyrrhachius and Aetius, but these 2 individuals were constantly at odds with one another, and that really held back the coherency of Irene's government. At the same time, the army was horrified and humiliated by the tribute that she was paying to the Abbasids, and because of the size of that payment and her massive tax breaks for the rich, they were worried that they wouldn't be able to get paid. Remember, in the ancient and medieval worlds, finances are very literal and direct. There's no such thing as deficit spending or printing out more money or anything like that. You either have money or you don't. And if you don't have money, then people don't get paid. The civil service, for obvious reasons, was also alarmed by her fiscal policies. They were expected to keep the state running, but to do so on a shoestring budget, and they were really not happy about it. This is all compounded by the fact that there were already existing sexist assumptions about women not being able to rule, about not being strong enough to rule, and this all must have seemed to be confirmed by the fact that Irene was failing horribly, and her only, way to keep on the power was just to kowtow to the elite and give them handouts over and over. That was all she had going for her at that point. So she appeared incredibly weak and vulnerable. And you can imagine if you're an ambitious aristocrat and you, say, have a family lineage that's pretty strong, you're probably thinking, hey, now might be my time to establish a dynasty. The Isaurians are on their way out. Also, speaking of that, she had no grandchildren to take up the reins of government. Constantine VI had been an only child, so there's not a cadet line there that she can serve as regent for. and Constantine's own children had died young. So there was no future, and she was a woman already in her 50s at this point. So she really didn't have much of a leg to stand on here. Most likely, the only reason why her reign lasted 5 years is because elite citizens were able to reap personal benefits from these massive tax cuts. There's really no other way to explain why people, especially ambitious aristocrats, just allowed this to go on for 5 years without stepping up and trying to seize power. They must just have wanted to make some bank. Irene's reign continued slowly and painfully, and in 800 she received a potential lifeline. That year, Charlemagne was crowned as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, and he decided that he wanted to have his title reach full legitimacy. And to achieve that, he needed recognition from Constantinople, the recognized center of the Roman world, and all that is Roman in the proper sense. So, he proposed that he and Irene should marry each other and thereby unite the Roman world. And he knew that despite her earlier objections to siding with a Western barbarian, at this point she's in dire straits, and she will look to any source of salvation that she can find, even if it is a barbarian. So, Irene seems to have carefully considered this offer, and it looks like she may have even been in favor of taking it, except that, she fell from power before she was able to come to a final decision, because rumors got out about her considering this offer, and the Byzantine aristocracy was not willing to brook an insult that great from Irene. They had had their fill, and they had also gotten rich off of her, so they decided to cut their losses and call it a day. So let's look at exactly why the Byzantines were so upset by this marriage proposal and why this was the straw that broke the camel's back. So by 802, Irene was dangerously unpopular, and the empire had been struggling for 5 years now under her rule, and it didn't look like things were going to get any better. So aside from the very rich who were making a lot of money by not having to pay taxes, everyone else was tired of this, and even they were beginning to grow concerned about the empire's setbacks on its frontiers and the growing weakness of the state. The real problem with the marriage proposal that Charlemagne put forward, however, is that, as Byzantine elites knew, Frankish Salic law prohibited female rule. So that meant that if she married Charlemagne, then he would rule the empire and not her. She would not be able to retain her independent role as the ruler at Constantinople. So that would put them under the rule of a foreign barbarian emperor, who none of them recognized as being Roman, despite the Pope crowning him emperor of the Romans. So this meant that the Byzantine aristocracy would finally jump into action and move against Irene. Irene's logothete, her finance minister Nicephorus, organized a coup, and he assumed power on October 31st, 802. This is his coin on the left. Irene was exiled to Lesbos, and then she died the next year in 803. So much for Irene. Now let's look at her legacy. So what is Irene's legacy? Well, first of all, she is almost certainly the most controversial Byzantine ruler, and if she's not the most controversial, then she's a close second to Justinian II. So, she's got that going for her, or against her, depending on how you look at it. Her rule also happened to coincide with Charlemagne's rule, and that means that Byzantium missed out on a lot of potential opportunities to work with the Franks or to work against them in order to assert their own Roman uniqueness, because the Franks were able to really penetrate the Roman legacy to some extent at the expense of the Byzantines because of the failures of Irene and the successes of Charlemagne. So say, had Irene allowed the marriage of Constantine and Rotrud to come to fruition, the two empires might have worked together, she might not have lost as much land in Italy, and the Byzantines would have been in a better position to capitalize on the division of the Frankish world after Charlemagne's eventual death. So it's possible that the Byzantines could have gained quite a bit by working more carefully with the Franks, and for whatever reason Irene squandered that opportunity, and I feel like a more capable ruler would have been better able to deal with that. Um, Her overthrow and blinding of her own son also doomed the Asarian line to extinction. By the time he was blinded and deposed, Constantine's child had died, but he was still a young man, and he could have, fathered another child, and then that child could have gone on to keep the Asarian line going, and perhaps either through Constantine or even his mother Irene, that child could have been raised and then taken power. By the time a child born at that time would have come of age, by that point Irene would be too old to keep ruling, and old age would outstrip her ambition, and maybe then she could step down with dignity and allow the line to go on. But that, of course, never happened because of when she overthrew her son and the fact that there was no one to replace him or to replace her once she died. Another legacy that Irene has going for her is that she is one of the most famous female monarchs in history. And if you look at any kind of list of women rulers throughout history, her name will be likely to appear, although usually not for the best of reasons. At any rate, though, that's all I've got to say about Irene, and next time we'll take a look at the equally controversial, or not equally controversial, but also controversial career of Nicephorus I.